Start recording. All right, boom. Welcome back. I'm at y'all with another one. I appreciate the love that y'all been showing me on the X-Men video that I did. I want to come and hit y'all with a follow-up, which is going to lead into a new playlist called Parallels, where we basically will introduce a comic book along with comparisons to historical events, people, places, and things. So for today's video, we're going to get into the relationship X-Men, eugenics, and Black Americans. And with that said, before we get too deep, I've got to hit you with the disclaimer. This video includes brief comic book images used under fair use for commentary, criticism, and educational purposes. All rights belong to their respective owners. Bing, 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 bing. All right, so now that that's out the way, let's go on ahead and get into this breakdown. So the X-Men use mutants as a metaphor for oppressed groups, but the darkest genetic themes, which are non-consensual experimentation, treating bodies as resources, they hit the hardest when you compare them to the real-life story of Henrietta Lacks and the history of eugenics. So Henrietta Lacks, born 19, well, not born, but in 1951, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Doctors at Johns Hopkins took her cells without asking. Every time I record, I got to do that shit. I don't know why, man. But anyway, doctors took her cells without asking for permission, right? Those cells became HeLa, the first immortal human cell line. Let that sink in. I'll repeat it again. Those cells became known as HeLa, H-E-L-A, the first immortal human cell line. They're still used today for polio vaccines, cancer research, COVID studies. Billions of dollars have been made while her family stayed poor and uninformed for decades. This is a textbook genetic exploitation of a marginalized person. So while we're still on this particular slide, you see I chose to put Trask on here. If you watch the Days of Future Past movie, he killed and, well, he had his employees, the mercenaries, kill and capture the members of the first class X-Men group. They were dissected. The genetic material was used for research, what would become part of his Sentinel program. In the same fashion that the doctors of that day experimented on Henrietta Lacks, and when she passed, they cannibalized her organs and her other genetic material, which was also monetized by them from their research on her body. And then, of course, I put Mystique on here because Mystique was the missing piece in X-Men Days of Future Past movie, where it was her genetic material that was the missing piece for Trask to finalize the Sentinels. So with that said, we're going to keep this thing moving. So the X-Men parallel, mutants born with the X gene. Society fears them as a genetic threat. Villains may kidnap them, experiment on them, courtesy, Weapon X, or turn them into slaves via Genosha's mutates. Mutates aren't people. They're resources or dangers to be controlled or erased. Sounds familiar? It's the same logic that justified taking Henrietta Lacks cells. So going further on some quick side-by-side type shit, you have non-consensual harvesting, the HeLa cells taken without consent. Mutants On the comic side of the equation, they were also taken, brainwashed, and experimented on. Dehumanization. Henrietta was reduced to Gila. Her name was erased. Her cells was named Gila to sort of reference her, but don't mention her by her original name. They take her out of history when they did that. Mutants were called jokes or natural resources. The racial angle. A black woman in segregated America and mutants as the stand-in for racial minorities. Put these things together. And if you're part of the LGBT community, then you can add a third part of that equation. Black women segregated in America, mutants as the stand-in for racial minorities, or as the stand-in for the LGBT community, or as the stand-in for immigrants, or as the stand-in for any other that is not part of mainstream white American society. All right, we're going to keep this thing moving. The irony, some Gila researchers were eugenicists. Some people who believed in engineering superior humans and sterilizing undesirables. Now, in this language of superior humans, of course, everybody might think of Hitler and the Nazi rhetoric of Uberman, which translates, I think, into Superman, basically, for all intents and purposes. But all of that rhetoric came from America. The Nazis seen what the Anglo-Saxon Caucasians were doing to Black Americans in America from the late 1800s coming into the early 1900s. They were taking notes, they were impressed, and they were inspired to do the same thing on their side. And that's exactly what the fuck they did. So for anybody who's watching this and, you know, a so-called student of history, if you demonize the Nazis and you don't demonize the white people who did our ancestors foul, then you are a biased, because the white people who did what they did to the Jewish people can't be scum of the earth, and the people that they learned these tactics from here in America not be, if we're following basic logic. All right, so am I saying all white people are bad and evil? No. The ones who did what they did are, yes, and may they burn in hell. Okay, so let's keep this thing moving. These eugenicists, they use the cell of a woman called inferior by society or by white society to chase their perfect human fantasy. In X-Men terms, humans stealing mutant DNA to build better weapons while denying mutant rights. That's not comic book dystopia. It's already happened in real life. Fuck you talking about? So, eugenics history. The US and the Nazis both did these things. Forced sterilizations. When you sterilize a person without their permission, you are not only murdering them, you're not murdering them, but you're murdering their future. You feel me? Everybody that they was ever going to give birth to, you've just cut off. You committed genocide in that one act. And that's what these devils did to our ancestors, as well as what the Nazis was doing to some of the Jewish people on that side of the equation. What else they was doing? Experiments, of course, on minorities, prisoners, the poor, all under the banner of improving humanity. In the Extinction Agenda storyline, where it showcased Genosha, they showed the end game. State-run genetic testing, mind wiping, slave labor, all sold as national security and economic progress. Now to go back to the United States, all of this shit was done in the best interest of America. You have a group of people enslaved to take your fucking, you take a 13 county from struggling to the most powerful nation in the world. That's based on the free slave labor. And then once these individuals are free, I believe it was J. Edgar Hoover who made references to, not to give a direct quote, but a paraphrase, something roughly saying that Black prosperity is a detriment to national security. We can't have these people who are supposed to be the bottom of society leveling up and becoming economically independent and politically independent. So you see the parallels there. And with that said, the final warnings from the X-Men. Fear of a genetic difference can justify horrible things from people who are in power in any society, especially if they know that your genetics are superior to theirs and they have the power to do with you as they will, because movies like Get Out and shit like that already tell you what it is. Motherfuckers wish they could have our genetics, their brains in our bodies. And with that said, I'm going to wrap this thing up. Just understand that Henrietta Lacks, she lives on to this day through the various vaccines that you may have ever taken in life. Her cells are still being used for future research. The only saving grace and bright spot in the scenario is that her family has, received some kind of compensation from either one or more of the biotech companies over the decades, finally, who have made billions and billions from using her genetic material. And with that said, I'll holler at y'all next. Like, subscribe, comment if you're feeling the content. If you got other comic book characters or subjects that you would like me to approach and research and make comparisons to some kind of comic book, characters, let me know and we'll get it popping. I'll holler at y'all next time.